Before viewing video lessons, it is important to read the textbook using the learning guide as your turn-by-turn directions. Then use the learning guide to take organized notes in your own words with examples and pictures. This video continues our lesson on stress, coping, and health with a portion of the motivation and emotion chapter. In this video, we will be looking at emotional responses to stress and also what makes up an emotional experience. So when we look at the stress response, we know that stress is triggered by potentially stressful events, but those events get filtered through our cognitive appraisal. This appraisal looks at whether they are threatening or not and whether or not we have the ability to cope. If we perceive something to be threatening and that it's kind of overwhelming or taxing our coping abilities, then we can have three different types of responses: emotional, physiological, and behavioral. In this video, we're going to focus on the emotional component. Now, in order to do this, we have to talk about what is an emotion. Well, it's one of those things in the world of psychology that everybody kind of knows what it is, but when you're asked to articulate and put it to words, you end up sounding kind of silly. Well, an emotion is like a feeling that you feel, and it's like something that you just feel. Now, that's not going to work very well to study scientifically. So in the world of psychology, we've actually studied emotions, and we've broken down the elements of an emotional experience. The first element is the cognitive component, and this is your own thoughts or your subjective conscious experience. So these are those things that you're saying to yourself inside your head when you're going through a particular experience. And we have some thoughts that are linked to sadness, some thoughts that are linked to anger, thoughts that are linked to joy. And when we break down emotions, a part of our emotional experience are those thoughts that we're saying to ourselves. Now, emotions are also felt physiologically within the body. Part of this physiological component of emotions, particularly emotions related to fear, has to do with the stress response. And so we know that when we perceive something as scary, triggers a fear response, the limbic system is going to trigger a whole chain of reactions that's going to cause our body to become aroused. And this is going to be sort of the classic fight or flight response in the autonomic nervous system. So when people are feeling a fear-based emotion, such as anxiety, worry, tension, anger, what we see is that their body will respond with these sorts of symptoms or changes. So things like your mouth becoming dry, your palms becoming sweaty, goosebumps, your heart rate beating, your maybe stomach getting a little butterflies in the stomach sort of feeling. All of those are part of the physiological component of emotion. Emotions affect our body in different ways. So this particular graphic shows pictures that look at the warmth of our body when we're feeling different types of emotions. And so as you can see, the fear-based emotions like fear and anger and anxiety, even shame is kind of a fear-based emotion, all have a physiological response of kind of making you hot up in the core, sometimes into your extremities in the case of anger. If you look at sadness and depression, you see a lot of similarities in sort of the coloring Shame has a little bit of fear and a little bit of sadness at the same time, so it's kind of a mixture of the two. If you look at happiness, you can see that, sometimes people describe feeling warm all over, and quite literally, when you're happy, you do feel warm all over. You also see that love has the most intense temperatures in the core, but that doesn't extend all the way down into the legs as it does with happiness. So we can see that whenever you're experiencing different emotions, your body responds. The last piece of the emotional experience is your behaviors. And there's a couple of different things that we're going to look at when we look at the behavioral component of emotions. One of these has to do with your facial expressions. So a lot of times we can tell how someone is feeling just by looking at their face. Sometimes their body language plays into that as well. So if somebody is really angry, not only can you see it in their face, but you can see it in their entire body and how they carry themselves. Some interesting research that we've done is we have shown people all around the world different images where the person is displaying different facial expressions associated with emotion. And so this woman has 4 different faces here: fear, disgust, happiness, and anger. And you can see that the one that people are most consistently identifying across cultures is happiness. So happiness is one that is readily recognized. If you look at disgust, most of the cultures recognize that face as disgust. New Guinea was a little bit strange with that one. But when it came to fear and anger, there was a little bit more of a disagreement across the cultures. And so while we do display our emotions in our face, we also know that our culture can affect how we display emotions and how we interpret those displays in others. Now, one of the interesting things about the behavioral component is that you can actually start to feel a particular emotion just by changing your body language and your face. So if I make a happy face, I will actually feel a little bit happier. And if I make a sad face, I'll feel sadder. If I make an angry face, I'll feel angrier. And in fact, this is one of the ways that we actually learn to empathize with other people. So if you walk into a room and your friend has a very upset face, you will walk over to them and ask them what's wrong, and then mimic their body language and their facial expression as you're talking with them. And that will help you to literally feel the emotion that they're feeling. And this is an important part of human social interactions. So now that we know what makes up an emotion, let's look at the emotional response to stress. So the type of emotion you feel is going to be dependent on your cognitive appraisals. And a lot of times we think that emotions are just about negatives. So when we're stressed out, we tend to focus on just the negative consequences of stress and the negative emotions associated with stress. But it turns out you can also feel positive emotions in response to stress. And it turns out that those positive emotions are really important to promoting something called resilience. So resilience has to do with how we can overcome our stressors. So people who experience positive emotions in the face of stress have increased problem solving and are more flexible. This means we're better able to deal with the situation that created the stress in the first place. Positive emotions can also help turn off that autonomic fight or flight response that we talked about. And they also can help us build social support. So if somebody is really angry, I tend not to want to approach them, but if they are grateful for their safety after a car accident, for example, then I'm more likely to approach them and offer support. Before we wrap up the emotional responses to stress, we need to talk about the appropriate level of our emotional arousal in order to best handle different types of stressors. This comes to us from the inverted U hypothesis. The inverted U hypothesis says that when a task is very, very simple, you need a high level of arousal just to kind of make an effort for it. So I kind of think about my husband likes to play the game Who Sings This Song, or What's the Name of This Song? And most of the time I don't really care to play this game, so I don't even really try because my level of emotional arousal isn't very high. I don't really care. But if I were to get a phone call from a radio station that said, if you can answer this question, you'll win $1,000, who sang this song? My level of arousal would be much higher. I would try, and I would have a greater chance of success because I would actually care about that outcome. Now, it turns out if something is really, really difficult, then having a high level of emotional arousal is actually not good. So when you're doing something really complicated and complex, if you start to get overly stressed about it, then you can actually have less performance than if you can keep that emotional arousal down. And so the key here is to have the level of emotional arousal that will spur you to do your best without overwhelming you. So in the case of this particular class, we have exams coming up, and you have to basically be worried enough about those exams to do a good job of preparing for them, but not so worried that you become overwhelmed by that. And so we want to have the optimal level of arousal. So in terms of our emotional response to stress, you need that optimal level, and you need to try to foster those positive emotions to promote resilience.